Hi. Imagine a buyer whose ability to close on the acquisition of real estate is contingent upon something happening. It might be contingent on their job transfer coming through. It might be contingent on the buyer's loan coming through. It might be contingent on the property appraising. But that same buyer wants to submit an offer without those contingencies in the offer because that buyer is concerned that if that buyer submits the offer with those straightforward contingencies in the offer, that the seller won't accept the offer. And at the time I'm recording this video, we are in a market where there are a lot of buyers chasing a very low level of inventory. And so buyers know that they're going to be competing, buyers know that they are going to be competing against a lot of other buyers to purchase the property. The buyers want to make their offers as attractive as possible, and so they want to leave out contingencies. Sometimes buyers have the impression that I don't need to include a loan contingency, for example, in my offer because I can always get out on some other contingency. Well, maybe not. What this topic is about is buyers using contingencies to back out of contracts, using a contingency for some purpose other than the purpose of that contingency. Now, let me start by saying there are contracts that have true what we call free look contingencies in the real estate world. There are a contingency that might say that the buyer's obligations to purchase this property is contingent upon the buyer being content with anything related to the property in the buyer's sole and absolute discretion. The buyer can back out for any reason or no reason at all as long as the buyer exercises their back out right by a certain date. Now, that wasn't intended to be dictation of actual language. That was just intended to be example, so you know what I'm talking about. That would be a true free look contingency. Some contracts do have true free look contingencies, but we find that to be, my experience is those contingencies are more in commercial real estate transactions, not so often in residential real estate transactions. If it's a true free look contingency, then maybe the buyer can back out for any reason or no reason at all by that deadline. In residential real estate, there's more of a culture of having what I call compartmentalized contingencies. There might be a loan contingency, there might be an appraisal contingency, there might be a contingency on the buyer being content with the inspection of the physical condition of the property. There might be a contingency with the buyer being content with the state of the title, etc., etc. Well, those contingencies are intended to be used for those purposes. Now, a lot of people who are watching this have seen situations where a buyer has used a contingency that is for one purpose, let's say an inspection issue, to get out for another reason, like that the buyer just found a better deal someplace else. And using a contingency for a purpose other than what it was intended works great until it doesn't. And how does it not work out? In my world, it doesn't work out in two ways. One is that somebody lets the cat out of the bag. For example, the agent for the buyer calls up the listing broker and says, hey, I'm disappointed as you are, but I'm going to be sending you a notice tomorrow that my buyer is terminating due to paragraph 18Z. That's a made-up number, by the way. They're terminating due to paragraph 18Z. It really bugs me, but they found another house they like better. Well, finding another house they like better might not be out under section 18Z, and then the battle is engaged. But the other way that buyers get in trouble doing this is there are just some sellers who don't cooperate with the death of the contract. And in a lot of residential contracts, the buyer puts up earnest money. That earnest money is held by some neutral third party. That neutral third party will not agree to release the earnest money back to the buyer unless the seller signs off on it. And the seller, whether it's based on something rational, whether it's based on a lucky guess, who knows, the seller refuses to cooperate with the return of the earnest money, and then there's a battle engaged, and the buyer is then put in a position of having to justify that they used their contingency appropriately. And you don't want to be the person who is the buyer in that situation. You don't want to be the person who advises the buyer, oh, don't worry, we don't need to have a loan contingency, for example, in your offer because you can always get out under this other contingency, it's risky. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it on this topic. Remember, we live in a complicated world. Be careful.